Arlington Air Base feels like the military's forgotten stepchild, tucked away in the Nevada desert where tumbleweeds outnumber visitors. Once home to the legendary Red Hawk Squadron, it's been reduced to a glorified maintenance depot since the fighter jets were reassigned in 2012. The hangars that once roared with F-22 Raptors now echo with the mundane hum of administrative paperwork and routine repairs. Captain Mara Devlin, 42, arrives at the front gate every morning at 0530 hours sharp in her beat-up Ford pickup. The guards barely glance up from their coffee anymore. She's been the first face through those gates for 14 years running. Her contractor ID reads Electrical Systems Specialist, and that's exactly how everyone sees her. The quiet woman who fixes broken generators and calibrates radar equipment that rarely sees real action. The younger soldiers call her Circuit Lady behind her back, usually followed by groans about another power outage or system failure. "Great, here comes trouble," Sergeant Danny Rodriguez muttered yesterday when he spotted her heading toward the communications building. "My Xbox is going to be down for hours." Mara never responds to the jokes. She just nods politely, carries her toolbox to wherever the problem is, and fixes it with methodical precision. A personnel file is deliberately thin: previous contractor work, basic security clearance, emergency contact listed as none. Nobody bothers digging deeper because, frankly, nobody cares enough to ask. The only person who occasionally looks at her with something resembling curiosity is Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hank Patterson, the graying records officer who's been stationed here longer than anyone can remember. Sometimes she catches him staring at her with this puzzled expression, like he's trying to solve a riddle that's been nagging at him for years. "You ever get the feeling you've seen her somewhere before?" Hank asked Major Williams last month during their weekly poker game. "Who, Circuit Lady?" "Nah, she's got one of those faces. Probably just reminds you of someone's sister or something." But Hank couldn't shake the feeling. There was something about the way she carried herself, too straight, too precise, like muscle memory carved from years of military discipline that ran deeper than contractor work. Every morning, Mara makes the same rounds. She checks the backup generators in Building C, tests the emergency lighting systems, and maintains the underground power lines that keep this forgotten base connected to the outside world. Most days, she's the only person who bothers cleaning the American flag when desert dust settles on it. The work suits her. It's methodical, predictable, and most importantly, invisible. She's become a ghost in plain sight, just another unremarkable face in the background of routine military life. Exactly as she planned it. Last Tuesday, she was walking past Hangar 9 when she noticed the old F-22 Raptor sitting under a dusty tarp. She paused for just a moment, long enough for Airman First Class Tyler Brooks to notice. "Hey," Tyler shouted with the authority of someone trying to impress his buddies. "Civilian personnel aren't authorized in this area. Don't you know basic security protocols?" Mara didn't argue or explain. She just nodded quietly and walked away, her work boots echoing softly on the concrete. But for just a split second, Tyler could have sworn he saw something flicker in her eyes, something that looked less like embarrassment and more like recognition. That night, alone in her small apartment off base, Mara sat at her kitchen table staring at a faded photograph tucked inside an old book. Three pilots in flight suits, arms draped over each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the invincible confidence of youth. The caption read, "Red Hawk Squadron, Afghanistan. 2011. L2R. Capt. Marcus Webb. Capt. James Torres. Capt. M. Devlin." She touched the glass gently, her finger tracing the face of the woman in the middle, someone who looked like her but younger, harder, with eyes that had seen combat and lived to tell about it. Tomorrow would be another day of fixing broken systems and staying invisible. Another day of serving in the shadows while the world moved on. never knowing that one of its forgotten heroes was still standing guard. But deep in her gut, something felt different. The same instinct that had kept her alive through 12 combat missions was whispering that change was coming to Arlington Air Base. She just didn't know how soon. Colonel Bradley Morrison arrived at Arlington Air Base 3 months ago with all the subtlety of a freight train. Fresh from a Pentagon assignment and hungry to make his mark, he saw the forgotten desert outpost as either a stepping stone to bigger things or a career graveyard, depending on how well he could whip it into shape. Morrison was everything the previous base commander wasn't: young, ambitious, and absolutely convinced that 14 years of relaxed standards had turned Arlington into a joke. At 38, he was the youngest colonel most of the soldiers had ever served under, and he made sure everyone knew it. "This base has been operating like a summer camp," he announced during his first all-hands meeting. "That ends now. We're going to run this installation like a real military operation, not some retirement community for desk jockeys." His first target was what he called civilian contractor oversight. Within weeks, he'd implemented new badge protocols, restricted access zones, and mandatory weekly briefings for all non-military personnel. The changes hit the support staff hard as people who'd been working the same jobs for years suddenly found themselves jumping through bureaucratic hoops just to do basic maintenance. Mara felt the shift immediately. Her keycard access was downgraded, requiring her to request escort for areas she'd been maintaining independently for over a decade. Simple repairs that used to take an hour now required 3 different signatures and a work order submitted 48 hours in advance. "Nothing personal," Morrison explained during their first face-to-face encounter. "But contractors have been getting too comfortable around here. This is a military installation, not a civilian workplace. We need accountability." Mara nodded. Respectfully, "Understood, sir. I just want to keep the systems running smoothly." "That's exactly the attitude we need," Morrison replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Professional distance. Clear chain of command. No more of this buddy-buddy nonsense. The changes weren't just administrative. Morrison had also brought his own inner circle, 3 junior officers, who'd followed him from his previous assignment and seemed to view Arlington as their personal kingdom. Captain Bradley Nash, his deputy, took particular pleasure in enforcing the new contractor protocols. "Hey, Circuit Lady," Nash called out last Wednesday when he spotted Mara heading toward the radar building. "Where's your escort? New rules say no contractor works alone in sensitive areas." "I was told Sergeant Rodriguez would meet me here," Mara replied calmly. "Well, I don't see Rodriguez. Guess you'll have to come back later." Nash's tone carried the casual cruelty of someone who enjoyed having power over others. Behind Nash, a couple of soldiers snickered. The message was clear. The old days of respectful coexistence were over. But it was Lieutenant Colonel Hank Patterson who first noticed something darker in Morrison's management style. During a staff meeting, Morrison had pulled up personnel files for all civilian contractors, making snide comments about dead weight and people who've gotten too comfortable. When Mara's file appeared on screen, thin and unremarkable as always, Morrison's expression turned particularly dismissive. 14 years of the same job? No advancement, no specialization, no initiative. This is exactly the kind of complacency we need to eliminate. Hank shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Sir, if Mara's work is exemplary. She's prevented dozens of system failures over the years. The base runs smoother because of her." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Lieutenant Colonel, I appreciate your loyalty to long-term personnel. But loyalty without standards is just enabling mediocrity. We need contractors who push themselves, not people who hide behind routine." That word, hide, hit Hank like a physical blow. Something about it, combined with Morrison's dismissive tone, crystallized the nagging feeling he'd carried for years. The way Mara moved, the way she held herself, the precision of her work. It wasn't the behavior of someone hiding from ambition. It was the behavior of someone hiding from something else entirely. After the meeting, Hank found himself walking past the electrical maintenance room more often, watching Mara work. She moved with an economy of motion that seemed almost choreographed, every gesture efficient, purposeful, like someone accustomed to operating in high-pressure situations, where wasted movement could mean the difference between life and death. When she thought no one was looking, her eyes would scan the sky with the automatic alertness of someone trained to watch for threats. And when the weekly test of the base's emergency alert system echoed across the installation, Mara would pause in her work for just a moment, not with the casual annoyance of a civilian hearing noise, but with the focused attention of someone whose survival had once depended on understanding what those sounds meant. Morrison's campaign against contractor complacency was escalating. He'd started requiring weekly performance reviews, threatened to restructure positions that didn't meet his standards, and made it clear that Arlington's civilian workforce was on borrowed time. "We're going to separate the wheat from the chaff," he told his inner circle during their Friday afternoon briefing. "Some of these people have been coasting for years. It's time to see who really deserves to be here." But Morrison had no idea he was picking a fight with someone who'd already proven she deserved to be anywhere she chose to serve. He was about to find out just how badly he'd underestimated the quiet woman fixing his electrical systems. The storm. Clouds were gathering over Arlington Air Base, and they had nothing to do with the weather. The humiliation came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Mara had arrived at her usual time, coffee in hand, ready to replace the aging transformer in Building D. It was routine work that she'd done 100 times before until Captain Nash appeared with his clipboard and his smug expression. "Hold. Up there, circuit lady," Nash said, blocking her path to the electrical room. "New protocol. All contractor work in sensitive buildings requires a qualified military observer." Mara paused, toolbox in hand. "I've been maintaining this system for 14 years, sir. It's just a transformer replacement." "Yeah, well, things change." Colonel Morrison wants eyes on all contractor activities. Can't have civilians wandering around unsupervised anymore. Nash's grin was particularly unpleasant. Security risk, you understand. The qualified observer turned out to be Airman Jenkins, a 19-year-old kid who'd been on base for exactly 6 weeks. He stood in the corner playing on his phone while Mara worked, occasionally glancing up to make sure she wasn't, apparently, sabotaging critical infrastructure. "This is so stupid," Jenkins muttered after an hour. "Lady, no offense, but you seem like you know what you're doing. I don't know why they need me babysitting you." Mara said nothing, just focused on her work. But the humiliation burned. She'd commanded respect from fellow pilots, had been trusted with million-dollar aircraft and life-or-death decisions. Now she needed a teenager's permission to change a light bulb. The breaking point came 3 days later. Mara was in the middle of diagnosing a complex electrical fault in the base's main communications hub when the power went out. Not just in the building, across the entire installation. The backup generators should have kicked in immediately, but something was wrong. In the darkness, she could hear the distant sound of frustrated voices and emergency lighting flickering. To life, she knew the system better than anyone. Give her 10 minutes, and she could have the main power restored. But protocol now required her to wait for Nash's approval and military supervision. Nash took 45 minutes to respond to her call. "Jesus Christ," he complained when he finally arrived. "Can't you people fix anything without holding our hands?" By then, the backup generators were overheating. The computer servers were starting to shut down automatically, and the base's connection to the outside world was hanging by a thread. Mara bit her tongue and got to work, but the damage was already done. What should have been a 10-minute fix took 3 hours to complete properly. That evening, Morrison called her into his office. "I'm disappointed, Devlin," he said, not looking up from his paperwork. Today's power outage was completely preventable. Basic maintenance, and you let it escalate into a base-wide emergency. Mara stood at attention, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, with respect, the fault was in a system that hasn't been serviced in 2 years. I've submitted multiple work orders requesting." "Excuses," Morrison cut her off. "I don't want to mend them one of them, eh? Your excuses. I want results. And frankly, your results have been declining since I arrived. Makes me wonder if you're the right person for this job." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Mara felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear, but recognition. She'd felt this before, in briefing rooms where politicians who'd never seen combat questioned pilots who'd risked everything for their country. "I understand your position, sir," she said quietly. Morrison finally looked up, studying her face. "Do you? Because I'm starting to think you've gotten too comfortable here, too set in your ways. Maybe it's time for some fresh blood in the contractor pool." That night, Mara sat in her truck in the base parking lot long after her shift ended, staring at the building she'd kept running for 14 years. She thought about the young soldiers who depended on the systems she maintained, the critical communications equipment that connected this forgotten outpost to the wider world, the generators that kept the lights on when the desert wind knocked down power lines. Morrison saw her as dead weight, a relic from a more relaxed era that needed to be swept away. He had no idea that she'd chosen this life deliberately, that serving in the shadows was her way of continuing to serve, period. But maybe it was time to stop hiding. In her apartment that night, Mara opened the wooden box she kept in her bedroom closet. Inside, carefully preserved in acid-free tissue paper, was her old flight suit. The fabric was still crisp, the patches still bright. The Red Hawk Squadron insignia seemed to glow in the lamplight. She held it up to the mirror, seeing not the weathered contractor that Morrison wanted to discard, but the combat pilot who'd earned every thread of that uniform through skill, courage, and sacrifice. Morrison thought he was dealing with someone who'd grown soft and complacent. He was about to learn that some people don't lose their edge, they just choose when to show it. The next morning, Mara arrived at work with something different in her step. She still carried her toolbox, still nodded politely to the guards, still looked like the same quiet contractor who'd been fixing their problems for over a decade. But Lieutenant Colonel Hank Patterson, watching her walk across the parking lot, noticed something he'd never seen before. Mara Devlin looked like a woman who'd made a decision, and in his gut, Hank knew that whatever decision she'd made, it was going to change everything at Arlington Air Base. The question was, would Morrison realize what he'd awakened before it was too late? Mara's counterattack began with what she did best: methodical preparation and careful observation. For 14 years, she'd been the invisible woman who knew every wire, every system, every corner of Arlington Air Base. Now she would use that knowledge differently. She started with Morrison's schedule. As the contractor responsible for maintaining the administrative building's electrical systems, she had legitimate access to every office, including the colonel's. She began timing her maintenance visits to coincide with his meetings, learning his patterns, his priorities, and most importantly, his weaknesses. Morrison was ambitious, but he was also careless. He left sensitive documents on his desk, spoke too loudly during phone calls, and treated support staff as if they were furniture invisible and unimportant. It was a mistake that many powerful people made, assuming that being ignored meant being powerless. During a routine check of the communication lines in Morrison's office, Mara overheard a phone conversation that made her blood run cold. "Yes, sir. I understand the timeline," Morrison was saying to someone on the other end. 6 months to show measurable improvement in operational efficiency. Cost reduction is the priority. Yes, that includes personnel restructuring. We're looking at eliminating several contractor positions that no longer serve essential functions. Mara's hands never stopped working on the electrical panel, but her mind was racing. Morrison wasn't just making her life difficult. He was planning to eliminate her position entirely, along with several others. The man was systematically dismantling the support structure that kept Arlington running, all in the name of efficiency. But Mara had resources Morrison didn't know about. That evening, she made a phone call she hadn't made in over a decade. General Patricia Hawkins' office. This is Sergeant Miller. I need to speak with the general, Mara said quietly. Tell her it's Red Hawk 3. The pause on the other end was long enough that Mara wondered if the connection had been lost. Then, please hold, ma'am. The general will speak with you immediately. General Hawkins had been a major when she'd served as Mara Squadron Commander in Afghanistan. She'd been promoted steadily over the years and now oversaw personnel assignments for the entire Western region. Mara? The voice was older, more refined, but unmistakably familiar. My God, we thought... The report said you were killed in that crash. I was supposed to be, Mara replied. Patricia, I need a favor. And I need to know that this conversation never happened. Whatever you need. Over the next hour, Mara learned everything she needed to know about Colonel Bradley Morrison. His service record was impressive on paper, but shallow in reality. A series of staff assignments and Pentagon rotations with minimal field experience. He'd never commanded troops in combat, never made decisions where lives hung in the balance. Most importantly, Morrison was being watched. His superiors were evaluating his performance at Arlington as a test of his readiness for bigger commands. The base was his proving ground, and he was under pressure to show results quickly. He's cutting costs everywhere, General Hawkins explained. But the brass is also watching to see if he maintains operational readiness. It's a balancing act, and from what I hear, he's struggling. Mara absorbed this information like intelligence briefings from her combat days. Morrison was vulnerable, but he was also dangerous, a man under pressure who was willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to advance his career. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, Lieutenant Colonel Hank Patterson. Hank had been conducting his own investigation, driven by the nagging certainty that he knew Mara from somewhere. Late one night in the records room, he finally found what he was looking for, a personnel transfer file from 2012, buried in a box of archived documents. The file was thin, but it contained a single photograph that made Hank's hands shake. 3. Pilots standing in front of an F-22 Raptor, arms around each other's shoulders. The woman in the middle had shorter hair and a younger face, but the eyes were unmistakable. Red Hawk Squadron, he whispered to himself. Missing in action, presumed dead. The next morning, Hank approached Mara while she was working on a generator, behind building CFAR from prying eyes and listening ears. Captain Devlin, he said quietly. Mara's hand stilled on the wrench she was holding. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. I was wondering when someone would figure it out. She finally said, not looking up from her work. Why? Hank asked. Why hide for all these years? Mara set down her tools and faced him. Because I was done being a weapon. I wanted to serve differently quietly, without glory or recognition. This base needed someone to keep the lights on. I needed a place to disappear. But Morrison's going to destroy you. He's going to eliminate your position and probably several others. Good people are going to lose their jobs because of his ego. I know. Mara's voice was steady, but Hank could see the resolve hardening in her eyes. That's why I'm going to stop him. How? Mara looked across the base toward the administrative building where Morrison was probably planning his next cost-cutting measure, by reminding him that this is still a military installation. and military installations need to be ready for anything. That afternoon, Mara began the most delicate phase of her plan. Using her access to the base's communication systems, she started monitoring radio chatter from the Regional Air Traffic Control Center. She reviewed maintenance schedules for the long-dormant aircraft in Hangar 9. She quietly tested systems that hadn't been activated in years. To anyone watching, it looked like routine maintenance. But Mara was preparing for something that Arlington Air Base hadn't seen in over a decade, a demonstration of what military readiness actually meant. Morrison thought he was dealing with a complacent contractor who'd grown soft over the years. He was about to learn that some people never stop being warriors. They just choose their battles more carefully. And this battle was about to begin. Mara's plan unfolded like a precision operation, each move calculated and deliberate. She began by documenting everything: Morrison's policy changes, the maintenance delays caused by his new protocols, the potential security vulnerabilities created by his cost-cutting measures. But documentation was just the foundation. The real power lay in the relationships she'd built over 14 years, relationships Morrison had completely overlooked. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez ran the base's administrative office and had worked closely with Mara for over a decade. When Mara quietly asked for copies of Morrison's efficiency reports and personnel restructuring plans, Gonzalez didn't hesitate. "That man's been making everyone's job harder," Gonzalez muttered as she discreetly photocopied documents after hours. "He treats us like we're disposable. Half the people he wants to eliminate are the ones who actually keep this place running." The documents revealed the scope of Morrison's plans. He intended to cut the contractor workforce by 40%, eliminate several critical maintenance positions, and centralize all technical work under military personnel who lacked the specialized experience to handle Arlington's aging systems. Mara studied the plans like intelligence reports, identifying weaknesses and opportunities. Morrison's biggest vulnerability was his inexperience with the base's actual operational needs. He saw costs and efficiency metrics, but he didn't understand the complex interdependencies that kept Arlington functional. That understanding would be his downfall. Mara's next move was reaching out to General Hawkins again, this time with specific intelligence about Morrison's management failures. "Patricia, I need you to understand something," Mara said during their second phone conversation. "Morrison isn't just cutting costs, he's compromising operational readiness. The base's emergency response capabilities have been degraded by his protocols. If something happened tomorrow, we wouldn't be able to respond effectively." "That's a serious accusation, Mara. Do you have documentation?" "I have everything. Maintenance delays, system failures, security protocols that prioritize bureaucracy over function. He's running this place like a business, not a military installation." General Hawkins was quiet for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" "An inspection, unannounced. Let your people see what 14 years of institutional knowledge looks like when it's about to walk out the door. I can't promise anything official, but there might be a routine efficiency review in Arlington's near future." Mara smiled grimly. "That's all I need." Meanwhile, Morrison's pressure campaign against the contractor workforce was intensifying. Captain Nash had started conducting random security audits of contractor work areas, searching through personal belongings and questioning employees about their activities. The harassment reached a crescendo when Nash accused Mara of exceeding her authorized access after finding her in the communications building during off hours. "What exactly were you doing here at 0630 hours?" Nash demanded, standing too close and using the intimidation tactics he probably learned from Morrison. "Emergency repair on the primary communication array," Mara replied calmly, holding up her work order. "The system failed during the night shift. I was called in to fix it." Nash snatched the work order, studying it like he might find evidence of espionage. This says the repair was authorized by Sergeant Miller. I don't see his signature, because it was a phone authorization during an emergency. Standard protocol for critical system failures. Not anymore, it's not. Nash's smile was unpleasant. New policy requires written authorization for all contractor work. No exceptions. You violated protocol. The formal reprimand went into Mara's personnel file that afternoon. Morrison had made his position clear. She was being pushed toward the exit, one bureaucratic harassment at a time. But Morrison had made a critical error. By targeting Mara so obviously, he'd created sympathy among the enlisted personnel who'd worked with her for years. Soldiers who'd never given her a second thought began to notice how differently she was being treated. Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd made jokes about Circuit Lady for years, found himself defending her during a barracks conversation. "Look, I know we give her crap sometimes, but she's solid," he told a group of younger soldiers. "She's fixed our stuff for years. Never asked for anything, never caused problems. Now Morrison's treating her like she's some kind of security risk? It's bullshit." The sentiment was spreading. Lieutenant Colonel Hank Patterson noticed it during his daily interactions with the troops. There was a subtle shift in mood, a growing resentment toward Morrison's authoritarian management style. More importantly, people were starting to ask questions about the woman they'd taken for granted. "Hey, LT," Airman Thompson asked during a routine briefing. "What's the deal with Mara? She's been here forever, right? Like, what did she do before she came to Arlington?" Hank felt the weight of the secret he was carrying. "She's been a contractor here for 14 years. Before that... He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Before that, she served her country in ways that most people will never know about." The cryptic answer only intensified the curiosity. Rumors started circulating, quiet speculation about the mysterious woman, who seemed to know more about military protocol than most contractors should. Morrison, oblivious to the shifting dynamics around him, continued his campaign against the PI's contractor workforce. He scheduled individual meetings with each civilian employee, ostensibly to discuss performance improvement opportunities, but really to document justifications for termination. Mara's meeting was scheduled for Friday at 1400 hours. She spent the week preparing for it like she'd once prepared for mission briefings. She gathered her documentation, rehearsed her responses, and steeled herself for what would likely be Morrison's final attempt to force her resignation. But Morrison had no idea what he was walking into. The quiet contractor he'd been systematically harassing for months was about to remind him that some battles are won not through force, but through patience, preparation, and the kind of strategic thinking that comes from surviving in situations where defeat means death. Friday at 1400 hours, the real war would begin. Morrison's office felt like a tribunal when Mara walked in at exactly 1400 hours. The colonel sat behind his desk with Captain Nash flanked to his right, a stack of personnel files spread between them like evidence in a court-martial. The setup was designed to intimidate two uniformed officers facing one civilian contractor across an expanse of military authority. Mara took the single chair positioned directly in front of Morrison's desk, her posture straight and her expression neutral. She'd faced hostile questioning before, in briefing rooms where politicians questioned operational decisions they'd never understand. This was familiar territory. "Ms. Devlin," Morrison began, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to discuss your future in Arlington Air Base." "I'm listening, sir." Morrison opened her personnel file, making a show of reviewing documents he'd obviously studied extensively. 14 years in the same position. No advancement, no additional training. Certifications, no initiative to expand your responsibilities. That suggests either a lack of ambition or a lack of capability. Or someone who found the right place to serve and chose to do it well. Nash smirked at her response. "Serve? You're a contractor, not a soldier. You fix electrical problems for a paycheck. Mara turned her attention to Nash, her gaze steady and unwavering. Captain, with respect, I've been keeping this base operational since before you graduated high school. Every system you depend on, every light switch that works when you flip it, every generator that kicks in during a power outage, that's my work for 14 years. Morrison leaned forward, irritated by her composure. And that work has become increasingly inadequate. System failures are up 23% since I arrived. Response times to maintenance requests have increased. Your performance metrics show clear decline. Sir, system failures are up because the equipment is aging and replacement requests have been denied. Response times have increased because new protocols require military escort for routine maintenance. The metrics reflect policy changes, not performance issues. Excuses, Morrison snapped. I don't want explanations. I want results. And frankly, I'm not seeing the results I need from civilian contractors who've gotten too comfortable. This was the moment Mara had been preparing for. She reached into her briefcase and placed a thin folder on Morrison's desk. Colonel May, I ask what you know about Arlington's operational history. Morrison glanced at the folder suspiciously. It's a support installation. Maintenance and administrative functions for the regional command structure. Before 2012, Mara continued quietly, this base was home to the Red Hawk Squadron, elite fighter pilots who flew combat missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. They were disbanded when budget cuts forced the consolidation of fighter operations to larger bases. Ancient history, Nash interjected. What's your point? Mara opened the folder and placed a photograph on the desk. 3 young pilots in flight suits, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of an F-22 Raptor. The confidence in their eyes was unmistakable, the bond between them evident. Even in a static image. Morrison studied the photo with mild interest. Okay, some old squadron photo. Again, what's your point? The point, Colonel, is that military installations have purposes beyond quarterly efficiency reports. They exist to defend this country, to project American power, and to be ready when the impossible becomes necessary. Mara stood up, her movement fluid and controlled. For the first time since she'd entered the office, Morrison looked uncertain. You've spent 3 months treating this base like a failing business that needs restructuring. You've implemented policies that prioritize bureaucracy over function, created barriers that prevent critical maintenance, and targeted for elimination the people who understand how this place actually works. Now, wait just a minute, Morrison started. I'm not finished, sir. Mara's voice carried an authority that filled the room, and both men fell silent. You see dead weight where you should see institutional knowledge. You see inefficiency where you should see dedication. You see costs that need cutting where you should see capabilities that need preserving. She moved to the window, looking out at the base she'd protected for 14 years. Every morning for 14 years, I've driven through those gates knowing that this place matters. Not because it's cost-effective or efficient, but because it's a piece of America's defense infrastructure. It's a place where people serve something bigger than themselves. Morrison's face was flushed with anger. Miss Devlin, I don't know what kind of speech you think you're giving, but the kind of speech that reminds you that this is still a military installation. Mara turned back to face him, and for the first time, Morrison saw something in her eyes that made him uncomfortable. And military installations need to be ready for anything. She picked up the photograph and placed it back in her folder. You wanted to discuss my future here, Colonel. Let me make it simple. I serve where I'm needed, how I'm needed, for as long as I'm needed. You can change my job title, modify my access, create whatever bureaucratic obstacles you want. But you cannot eliminate the mission. What mission? Nash demanded. You're a maintenance contractor. Mara smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Captain, you have no idea what I am." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a jet engine from the commercial flight path overhead. Morrison stared at Mara with a mixture of confusion and growing unease. "I think this meeting is over," Morrison said finally. "Ms. Devlin, you can expect a formal review of your contract status within the week. I suggest you use that time to consider whether Arlington Air Base is still the right fit for your talents." Mara nodded politely. "Colonel, I hope you never have to learn what my talents actually are. But if that day comes, I'll be ready." She walked out of the office with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained for 14 years, leaving Morrison and Nash staring after her with the uncomfortable feeling that they'd just made a serious mistake. Outside, Lieutenant Colonel Hank Patterson was waiting in the hallway. "How did it go?" he asked quietly. Mara paused beside him, her expression thoughtful. "Hank, how current are the emergency response protocols for this base?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, if something happened tomorrow, if Arlington suddenly needed to function as an operational military installation instead of an administrative outpost, would we be ready?" Hank felt a chill run down his spine. "Mara, what are you planning?" She looked at him with the same steady gaze that had unsettled Morrison moments before. "I'm not planning anything, Hank. I'm just making sure we're prepared for whatever comes next." As she walked away, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that Mara Devlin knew something the rest of them didn't. And that very soon, they were all going to find out what it was. The alarm that shattered the pre-dawn quiet of Arlington Air Base on Tuesday morning was a sound that hadn't been heard in 14 years. The piercing wail of a Level 1 emergency alert sent soldiers stumbling from their bunks, hearts pounding with the primal fear that comes from knowing something is terribly wrong. Colonel Morrison burst into the command center still pulling on. His uniform jacket, his face pale in the red glow of emergency lighting. "What's the situation?" Master Sergeant Kelly, the senior radar operator, looked up from his console with wide eyes. "Sir, we have 4 unidentified aircraft, military signatures, penetrating restricted airspace. Distance, 18 nautical miles and closing fast. Speed and formation suggest hostile intent." The command center erupted into controlled chaos, as personnel who'd never faced a real emergency scrambled to implement protocols they'd only practiced in simulations. Morrison stared at the radar screen, watching 4 crimson dots race toward their position like missiles. "Response options?" he barked. "Sir, we ... But Kelly swallowed hard. "Sir, we don't have any active combat aircraft. The last F-22s were transferred to Nellis in 2012. We have no intercept capability." Morrison felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. In his 3 months at Arlington, he'd focused entirely on administrative efficiency. He'd never considered that this forgotten outpost might actually need to defend itself. What about regional support? Nellis, Edwards, anyone? "Already contacted, sir. Nearest combat aircraft are at least 20 minutes out. At current speed, the bogies will reach us in 8 minutes. Captain Nash, who'd been Morrison's shadow through every bureaucratic battle, now looked like he might vomit. "Sir, what are our defensive options?" The answer came from Lieutenant Colonel Hank Patterson, who'd arrived in the command center with a grim expression. "We don't have any." Morrison eliminated the emergency response protocols as unnecessary overhead last month. Morrison spun on him. "This isn't the time for Colonel." The shout came from Airman Thompson, who was running toward them, clutching a manila folder. "Sir, I was checking the archived personnel files like you ordered, and I found this." Thompson thrust the folder at Morrison with shaking hands. Inside was a faded military ID card, a transfer order from 2012, and a photograph that made Morrison's knees go weak. The ID read, "Captain Mara J. Devlin, Red Hawk Squadron, combat pilot." The photograph showed 3 pilots in flight suits, standing in front of an F-22 Raptor. The woman in the middle was unmistakably younger, but the face was impossible to mistake. "Red Hawk Squadron," Hank said quietly. "The elite fighter unit that was stationed here before the base was downgraded." They were all reported missing in action during their final deployment to Afghanistan. Morrison stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. The quiet contractor he'd been systematically harassing. The woman he'd dismissed as dead weight. The maintenance worker he'd been planning to eliminate. "Dear God," he whispered. "She's been here the whole time." "Sir," Kelly's voice cut through Morrison's shock. "Bogey's now 6 minutes out. We need a decision." Morrison looked around the command center at faces filled with fear and uncertainty. These were good soldiers, but they were support personnel, administrators, mechanics. None of them had ever faced combat. None of them knew what to do when theory became deadly reality. "Where is she?" Morrison asked, his voice barely audible. "Who, sir?" "Devlin. Where's Mara Devlin?" Thompson pointed toward the window. "Sir, she's in Hangar 9. She's been there since 0500, working on the old aircraft." Morrison ran. He sprinted across the tarmac faster than he'd moved since basic training. Nash and Hank closed behind him. The hangar doors were open, and inside, under the harsh fluorescent lights, they could see the silhouette of someone working beneath the belly of an aircraft that shouldn't have been functional. The F-22 Raptor looked like it had been resurrected. The dust covers were gone. The engines were humming with electronic life, and all the systems were glowing with ready status. It was impossible. The aircraft had been mothballed for over a decade. Mara emerged from beneath the wing, wiping her hands on a cloth. She was wearing her old flight suit, the Red Hawk patches clearly visible, her hair pulled back in the same military style she must have worn 15 years ago. She looked at Morrison without surprise, as if she'd been expecting him. 4 aircraft, she said simply. Coordinated attack formation. They'll reach the base in 4 minutes. Morrison's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Finally, he managed. You're Red Hawk 3. You've been here all along." "I never left, Colonel. I just changed how I served." "But the report said you were killed in Afghanistan. Your whole squadron was—" "My squadron was eliminated. I survived." Mara's voice carried the weight of survivor's guilt and 14 years of questions she'd never answered. "I came home to find the program disbanded, the base downgraded, and no place for a combat pilot in a peacetime military. So I found another way to serve." The base-wide intercom crackled to life. "All personnel, 3 minutes to impact. Take emergency shelter positions." Mara walked to the aircraft's ladder with the fluid motion of someone returning home after a long journey. "Colonel, this base has been under my protection for 14 years. I've kept the lights on, the systems running, and the flag flying. Today, I'm going to keep the people safe." Morrison found his voice. "It can't. That aircraft hasn't flown in years. You haven't flown in years." Mara paused at the cockpit, looking back at him with something that might have been amusement. "Colonel, a pilot never stops being a pilot. We just sometimes choose to serve differently." She climbed into the cockpit, and the canopy began to lower. Through the glass, they could see her hands moving across controls with the muscle memory of someone who'd spent years perfecting the deadliest form of flight. The engines roared to life with a sound that Arlington Air Base hadn't heard since 2012. The F-22 Raptor rolled toward the runway that Mara had been quietly maintaining for over a decade, ready for a moment that everyone thought would never come. In the command center, radar operators watched in stunned silence as a friendly signature appeared on their screens for the first time in years. The call sign appeared automatically, Red Hawk 3. Morrison stood in the hangar doorway, watching. The aircraft he'd dismissed as obsolete streak into the dawn sky, piloted by the woman he'd treated as disposable. For 14 years, Arlington Air Base had been protected by a guardian angel who fixed their electrical problems and asked for nothing in return. Now, as enemy aircraft closed in with deadly intent, they were about to discover what kind of warrior had been walking among them all along. The battle for Arlington Air Base was about to begin, and their salvation was flying toward it at Mach 2. The aerial battle lasted 11 minutes and 17 seconds. In the command center, Morrison and his staff watched in stunned silence as Red Hawk 3 engaged 4 enemy aircraft in a display of flying that defied everything they thought they knew about combat aviation. Mara's voice came through the radio with the calm professionalism of someone who'd done this before. Command: Red Hawk 3 engaging multiple hostiles. Recommend all ground personnel maintain shelter positions. What followed was a masterclass in aerial combat that military academies would study for decades. Using cloud cover and terrain masking, Mara engaged the enemy aircraft one by one, exploiting their coordination against them. Her first kill came from a vertical climb that pulled her attacker into a stall, leaving him helpless for a missile lock. The second fell to a diving attack that used the sun as camouflage. The third enemy pilot, realizing he was facing someone far beyond his skill level, attempted to disengage. Mara let him go. She wasn't interested in pursuing fleeing aircraft when she had a base to protect. The fourth pilot, either more skilled or more desperate, engaged in a twisting dogfight that pushed both aircraft to their mechanical limits. For 8 minutes, the two jets danced through the sky in a deadly ballet that ended when Mara executed a maneuver that the F-22's computer system said was impossible, a flat spin recovery that put her on her opponent's tail with a firing solution that left no room for escape. When the sky fell silent, Red Hawk 3 was the only aircraft still flying. Mara's landing was textbook perfect, despite flying an aircraft that shouldn't have been functional with systems that had been dormant for over a decade. As she taxied back to Hangar 9, ground personnel who'd spent years taking her for granted lined the runway in silent respect. Colonel Morrison was waiting when she climbed out of the cockpit. His face was ashen, his uniform wrinkled from stress, and his hands were shaking. "Captain Devlin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are we ... Mara removed her helmet, her hair damp with sweat, her eyes showing the focus that comes from surviving mortal combat. She looked at Morrison with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained through months of harassment and bureaucratic humiliation. "Colonel, the base is secure. All hostile aircraft have been eliminated or driven off. I recommend we contact Regional Command to report the engagement and request a full investigation into how enemy aircraft penetrated this far into restricted airspace." Morrison nodded mutely, still trying to process what he'd just witnessed. The contractor he'd dismissed as dead weight had just saved everyone on the base with flying skills that belonged in the realm of legend. "Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Hank." Patterson approached with a folder in his hands. "I have General Hawkins on the secure line. She wants a full briefing on the engagement." Mara's expression softened slightly. "Patricia's still looking out for me after all these years. You know General Hawkins?" Morrison asked weakly. "She was my squadron commander in Afghanistan. She's one of the few people who knew I survived." Mara began walking toward the administrative building. "Colonel, with your permission, I'd like to make that report myself." The conversation with General Hawkins lasted an hour. When Mara emerged from the secure communication room, she found Morrison waiting with the entire base command staff assembled. Behind him, "Captain," Morrison began, then stopped and corrected himself. "Mara, I owe you an apology that words can't adequately express. I've spent 3 months trying to eliminate the one person who was actually keeping this base ready for exactly what happened today." Mara nodded but said nothing. Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger. I came here thinking I understood military efficiency. I thought I knew what this base needed. I was wrong about everything, but I was most wrong about you." "Colonel, you weren't wrong about everything," Mara replied. "This base did need changes. It had grown complacent. But the solution wasn't to eliminate institutional knowledge. It was to combine that knowledge with renewed purpose." She looked around at the assembled personnel, many of whom were meeting her eyes for the first time in years. "For 14 years, I've served this base as a contractor because I believe that service comes in many forms. I fixed your generators, not because it was a job, but because those generators keep the lights on for soldiers who are serving their country. I maintained your communication systems because staying connected to the outside world matters. I cleaned the flag because symbols of what we're protecting matter too." Master Sergeant Kelly stepped forward. "Ma'am, why didn't you ever tell us who you were?" Mara smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. "Because I didn't need you to know who I was. I needed you to know that someone was watching over you. The identity of that someone wasn't important. The protection was." Morrison cleared his throat. "Captain, I'd like to offer you the position of Base Operations Officer. Full reinstatement of your military rank, command authority over all defensive preparations, and no, thank you, Colonel." The refusal stunned everyone present. "I appreciate the offer, but I found my place here. I'd like to continue as I've been maintaining the systems, fixing what's broken, keeping things running. But I'd also like to establish a training program for some of the younger personnel. Combat readiness isn't just about having the right equipment. It's about having people who understand that readiness is a daily commitment." Morrison nodded slowly. "Whatever you need, whatever resources, whatever authority, whatever support, it's yours." Over the following weeks, Arlington Air Base transformed in ways that had nothing to do with organizational charts or efficiency metrics. The change was cultural, spiritual even. Soldiers who'd grown comfortable with routine began approaching their duties with renewed seriousness. Equipment that had been maintained adequately was now maintained with pride. Mara returned to her quiet routines, arriving first each morning and leaving last each evening. But now, when she walked across the base, soldiers straightened with genuine respect. When she worked on their systems, they watched and learned. When she raised the flag each morning, a duty she'd performed alone for 14 years, she was joined by volunteers who understood that some rituals are sacred. Colonel Morrison's quarterly report to Regional Command was unlike anything he'd ever written. Arlington Air Base has achieved a level of operational readiness that exceeds all measurable standards. This improvement is directly attributable to the dedication of personnel who understand that military service is not a job, but a calling. Most significantly, this base has been protected for 14 years by a guardian who asked for nothing but the opportunity to serve. We are not just operationally ready. We are honored to serve alongside heroes who teach us daily what true service looks like. 3 months later, Mara received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. 4 F-22 Raptors in formation, their wings nearly touching, with a simple inscription on the back: "Red Hawks forever. Thank you for coming home." She placed the photograph on her workbench, where it joined the tools she used to keep Arlington Air Base running smoothly. Outside, young airmen were practicing emergency response procedures with the intensity of people who'd learned that preparedness isn't theoretical. That evening, as she lowered the American flag at sunset, a ritual she'd performed alone for over 5,000 days, Sergeant Rodriguez approached and asked quietly, "Ma'am, would you mind if I helped with that?" Mara handed him one corner of the flag, and together they folded it with the precision that military protocol demanded and the reverence that the symbol deserved. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said. "No, ma'am," Rodriguez replied. "Thank you. for everything. As they walked back toward the administrative building, Mara reflected on the lesson that had taken her 14 years to fully understand. True, heroism isn't about flying higher or faster than anyone else. It's about showing up every day, doing the work that needs to be done, and being ready when others need you most. The maintenance contractor and the combat pilot weren't different people. They were different expressions of the same unbreakable commitment to serve. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't defeating the enemy in spectacular fashion. Sometimes it's simply being there when your country calls, ready to answer with everything you have. The quiet guardian of Arlington Air Base had taught them all that lesson, one perfectly maintained system at a time. In the end, Colonel Morrison learned what Mara had known all along. The most important battles are often fought by people whose names will never appear in history books, whose sacrifices go unrecognized, and whose service is measured not in medals or promotions, but in the simple fact that when darkness falls, the lights stay on because someone cared enough to keep them burning. And at Arlington Air Base, they would burn bright for as long as Mara Devlin drew breath. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.